Blood tastes like old copper pennies. I learned that on a Tuesday, spitting into a chipped porcelain sink while my ribs screamed. 2 days later, I'm pinning the hem of a $5,000 suit, praying the bruising doesn't show through my collar. But Kieran Shaw doesn't miss things. He catches my wrist, his thumb brushing the purple edge of my secret. His voice is quieter than a gunshot, but just as final. Tell me his name, Nora. I'll end it. The bell above the shop door didn't ring. It choked out a dull, metallic clatter. I didn't look up right away. My attention was fixed on the needle slipping through the heavy charcoal wool of a custom hem. The shop smelled like it always did at 9 in the evening, burnt starch, hot iron plates, and the faint, dusty scent of old fabric. I took a breath. It was a mistake. A sharp electric spike of pain radiated from my lower left ribs, wrapping around to my spine. I exhaled through my teeth, short and fast, letting the air leak out so my chest wouldn't expand. Tom had been wearing his work boots. He usually wore sneakers when he drank, which meant Tuesday night was a miscalculation on my part. I should have checked the hallway for the heavy, mud-caked soles before I asked him about the missing rent money. "You're here late." The voice came from the front counter, low, rough around the edges like gravel dragging over hardwood. I swallowed the dry lump in my throat and looked up. Kieran Shaw stood by the register. He wasn't a large man in the cartoonish, muscle-bound sense, but he took up all the oxygen in the room. He wore a black overcoat that was wet at the shoulders. Outside, the rain was coming down in sheets beating against the storefront glass, but Kieran didn't look damp or cold. He just looked impatient. "Rush order," I said, forcing my voice to stay even. I stood up from the stool behind the cutting table. My knees felt hollow. "Mr. Gable needs his jacket for a flight tomorrow." Kieran didn't care about Mr. Gable. He walked around the counter, stepping into the workspace where customers weren't supposed to go. I didn't tell him to stop. You didn't tell men like Kieran Shaw what to do. You just let them move and tried not to get caught in the draft. He stopped a few feet from me and shrugged off his overcoat. Beneath it, his suit was immaculate, dark, navy cut, sharp enough to draw blood. I was the one who tailored it 3 months ago. I knew the exact measurements of his shoulders, the drop of his waist, the holster allowance sewn into the left breast panel. "I tore the lining," he said, holding out a dark grey blazer. I stepped forward, taking the jacket from him. Our fingers didn't brush, but I could feel the heat radiating off his skin. The fabric smelled faintly of expensive vetiver cold rain and something sharper underneath. Gun oil. Not the first time I'd smelled it on his clothes, and I was cynical enough to know it wouldn't be the last. I made a living fixing the tears and bloodstains of men who ran the city's underbelly. It paid the bills, kept the lights on. It was supposed to keep me safe. "I can fix it," I murmured, turning the jacket inside out. There was a jagged rip near the armpit. "Looks like you caught it on a nail." "Something like that." Kieran's pale eyes stayed locked on my face. He didn't look at the jacket. He looked at the heavy woolen scarf wrapped securely around my neck. It was sweltering in the shop. The steam press had been running for 3 hours. Sweat was prickling at my hairline, making my skin itch, but I couldn't take the scarf off. The bruising on my collarbone was a hideous, blooming mess of violet and sickly yellow. "You're sweating," he observed. "It's the press." I lied, stepping back to put distance between us. My rib throbbed. "I'll have this done by tomorrow afternoon." "I'll wait." "It's going to take an hour, Mr. Shaw." "I have an hour." He pulled out one of the wooden fitting chairs, the legs scraping against the linoleum, and sat. He crossed his ankles. He didn't pull out a phone. He didn't look around the room. He just watched me. My stomach gave a slow, miserable twist. I was exhausted. My bones felt like lead, and my skin felt too tight for my body. Having him sit there perfectly still, watching my every movement, was a different kind of pressure. Tom's violence was erratic, loud, a sudden explosion of flying glass and shouting. Kieran's danger was silent. A deep, freezing lake. If you fell in, you didn't splash. You just went under. I turned my back to him, picking up my shears and a spool of silk thread. I needed to focus. I raised my right arm to thread the needle, and my body betrayed me. A muscle spasm seized my bruised side. My hand jerked the heavy metal shears slipping from my fingers. They hit the wooden floorboards with a loud clack. I hissed, grabbing the edge of the cutting table as my knees buckled for a fraction of a second. I caught myself leaning my weight against the wood eyes squeezed shut as the pain bloomed hot and sickening in my chest. Nora! I didn't hear him get up. He was just suddenly there, right behind me. I'm fine, I choked out, not turning around. I bent down to pick up the shears, moving stiffly, keeping my torso rigid. Before my fingers could graze the metal, a large hand clamped around my upper arm. Kieran pulled me upright, not forcefully, but with enough immovable weight that I couldn't resist. He spun me around to face him. I flinched. It was an ugly, instinctual reaction. My shoulders rounded, my chin dropped, and I brought my hands up a pathetic half-block, anticipating a strike. Silence stretched between us, thick and suffocating. I slowly opened my eyes. Kieran was staring down at me. The absolute stillness in his face had cracked. His jaw was locked so tight the muscle twitched under his skin. He was looking at my raised hands, at the way I was cowering from him. I dropped my arms quickly, my cheeks burning with a hot, shameful flush. Sorry, I mumbled, staring at his tie. I dropped the shears. I'm just jumpy today. Look at me. I shook my head, keeping my gaze firmly planted on his chest. I'll get your jacket done right now. If you'll just... Nora! The gravel in his voice scraped deeper. Look at me. I dragged my eyes up to his. The coldness in his pale irises was gone, replaced by something darker, something volatile that made the hair on my arms stand up. He didn't ask another question. He just reached out. I tried to step back, but the cutting table dug into my hips. I was trapped. His hand moved toward my face, his knuckles grazing the line of my jaw. His touch was absurdly light, a stark contrast to the heavy, violent aura he carried. His long fingers hooked the edge of the thick woolen scarf wrapped around my neck. Don't, I whispered. My voice cracked. He didn't listen. With a slow, deliberate tug, he pulled the knot loose. The heavy fabric unwound and fell away, pooling around my shoulders. The cool air of the shop hit my skin, followed immediately by the heat of his gaze. I knew what it looked like. I had stared at it in the bathroom mirror for 20 minutes this morning. 3 distinct, dark, purple fingerprints on the left side of my neck, fading into a muddy yellow patch near the hollow of my throat. And just below that, peeking out from the collar of my blouse, the dark, swollen edge of a collarbone that had taken the brunt of a heavy shove against a doorframe. Kieran's chest stopped moving. He stopped breathing. The silence in the room became violently heavy. The hiss of the steam press faded into the background. I could hear the rain outside. I could hear the erratic, panicked thumping of my own heart. He didn't touch the bruises. He knew better than to press on damaged tissue. But his hand hovered an inch over the fingerprints on my neck, his fingers curling inward as if he were trying to choke out an invisible ghost. Who? He asked. It was a single word completely devoid of inflection. That terrified me more than if he had screamed. It was an accident. I said the lie, tasting like ash in my mouth. I was moving boxes in the back. One of them fell from the top shelf. I caught the corner of it. Kieran finally looked back up at my eyes. A muscle worked in his cheek. He looked insulted. Insulted that I thought he was stupid enough to believe that. A box, he repeated flatly. Yes. He stepped closer, closing the last fraction of space between us. His chest brushed against my forearms. Boxes don't have fingers, Nora. They don't leave thumbprints on windpipes. He dropped his hand from my neck and gripped my hip instead, his fingers pressing into the fabric of my skirt. He felt the rigid, unnatural way I was holding my torso. His brow furrowed, and before I could stop him, his hand slid up my side, pressing lightly against my ribs. I gasped a sharp, ragged sound and tried to twist away. His grip instantly vanished. His hands shooting up in surrender, but the damage was done. He had felt the heat of the swelling through my clothes. He had felt my body instinctively recoil from the agony. "Your ribs are cracked," he stated. It wasn't a question. "Bruised." I corrected miserably, the fight draining out of me. I leaned back against the table, suddenly feeling very small, very tired. "Just bruised. It's not a big deal, Kieran. Please, just let it go. Let it go." He let out a short, dark sound that wasn't a laugh. He turned his head, looking toward the dark front windows of the shop, staring at the streetlights reflecting off the wet pavement. When he looked back at me, the casual, indifferent Mafia boss was gone. In his place was an executioner. Someone put their hands on you. Someone broke your ribs and choked you until your neck bruised, and you want me to let it go? It's complicated. I whispered, hating how weak I sounded, hating that I was defending Tom. I wasn't defending him, really. I was defending the miserable, predictable routine of my life. If Tom was gone, I had nothing. I had this shop, the debt he left me, and a crushing sense of loneliness. It's not complicated, Kieran said softly. He stepped back in, caging me against the table, his arms bracing on the wood on either side of my hips. He leaned down, his face inches from mine. The smell of vetiver and cold rain enveloped me entirely. "Tell me his name, Nora. I'll end it." I stopped breathing. The world seemed to tilt on its axis, spinning sickeningly under my feet. "No," I breathed out. "Is it a boyfriend, a husband you never mentioned, a debt collector?" Kieran's eyes scanned my face, searching for a twitch, a flinch, a tell. "Because if it's a collector, I own this block. Nobody collects here without my say-so, which means whoever did this to you is a dead man walking anyway." "He's not a collector," I said quickly, panic spiking in my chest. He's an ex. He drinks. He lost his temper. He lost his temper," Kieran repeated, tasting the words like they were poisoned. "And when he loses his temper, he treats you like a punching bag. It's none of your business, Kieran. You're a customer." "I'm a lot of things, Nora. But right now I'm the guy who is going to find the piece of shit who did this and bury him under the new overpass on 4th Street. He said it so casually, as if he were offering to fix a leaky faucet. That was the terrifying reality of Kieran Shaw. I spent my days pinning fabric, worrying about overdue electric bills, and keeping my head down. He spent his days rearranging the city's hierarchy with blood and cement. We existed in the same city but entirely different universes. Until now. "You can't do that," I told him, pushing my hands flat against his chest. The wool of his vest was warm over his heart. I could feel the steady calm beat beneath my palms. It made me dizzy. "I'm not asking for your help." "I didn't offer help. I stated a fact." He looked down at my hands on his chest, then back up to my face. "You stitch me up, Nora. You keep my mouth shut when the cops come by asking if I was in here on a Tuesday night. You're mine to protect." "I'm not yours." I shot back a flash of genuine anger, finally cutting through the fear and exhaustion. "I don't belong to you. I don't belong to the mob. I just hem your pants, Kieran, that's it." "Then why are you shaking?" His voice dropped an octave, hitting a frequency that rattled straight through my battered ribs. I froze. I was shaking. A fine, uncontrollable tremor had taken over my hands, vibrating through my arms and into his chest. "Because I'm tired." I confessed, the anger evaporating as quickly as it came, leaving nothing but a hollow, aching void. "I'm so tired, Kieran. If you kill him, the cops will come asking questions, or his friends will come looking. It will drag me into a world I don't want to be in. I just want him to leave me alone." "He won't." Kieran's tone was absolute. He didn't say it with malice. He said it with the weary certainty of a man who understood violence better than anyone else. Men who hit women don't stop. They escalate. Next time he loses his temper, you won't just have bruised ribs. I'll be coming in here to collect a suit, and there will be police tape on the door. He reached up his thumb, gently tracing the line of my jaw, completely avoiding the bruises. The contrast between his lethal words and his gentle touch was jarring. It made my throat ache with a sudden, stupid urge to cry. I hadn't cried when Tom hit me. I had just been numb. Give me the name Nora. No. I stepped sideways, sliding out from the cage of his arms. It pulled at my ribs, but I needed the distance. I walked to the counter, grabbing his torn jacket with trembling hands. I'm fixing your jacket. You're going to pay me and you're going to leave. Kieran didn't follow me. He stood by the cutting table, his hands sliding slowly into his pockets. He watched me wrestle the heavy blazer onto the sewing machine, his expression unreadable. I don't need you to tell me, he said quietly over the hum of the machine turning on. I stopped. My foot hovered over the pedal. I have men who can pull the security footage from the alley outside your apartment. I can pull your phone records. I can ask the owner of the bodega down the street who he saw dragging you by the wrist 3 nights ago. Kieran tilted his head, his eyes flat and dark. I can find out by midnight, but I want you to tell me. Because if you tell me, you're making a choice. You're choosing to survive. I stared at the needle, the silver tip gleaming under the harsh fluorescent light of the machine. Tom's face flashed in my mind. The red, sweaty flush of his skin, the smell of cheap gin, the sickening thud of his fist connecting with my side. I hated him. I wanted him gone. But the finality of Kieran's offer sat heavy in my stomach. I was handing a death sentence to a man. I swallowed hard, the bruise on my throat tightening. Tom, I whispered to the fabric. His name is Tom Miller. Kieran didn't say a word. I heard the scrape of his leather shoes on the floorboards, the rustle of his overcoat being picked up. Leave the jacket. Kieran said, his voice returning to that low, detached gravel. I won't be needing it tonight. The door opened and closed. The bell didn't ring, and for the first time in 3 days I took a full, deep breath. It still hurt, but the air felt clean. The deadbolt on the shop door always stuck. It required a specific upward jerk of the key, followed by a heavy shove of the hip against the wood. Normally it was muscle memory. Tonight the motion sent a jagged, white-hot tear of agony through my left side. I leaned my forehead against the cold condensation-slicked glass of the door, panting my breath, fogging the pain. Outside, the rain had reduced to a miserable, spitting drizzle. The streetlights bled into the puddles, casting greasy neon streaks across the asphalt. I pulled my coat tighter around my shoulders, shivering. The heavy woolen scarf was back around my neck, knotted twice. It felt like a noose, but it hid the damning yellow-purple evidence of my own stupidity. I walked the 4 blocks to my apartment, a 3rd-floor walk-up situated above a dry cleaner that constantly vented the sour smell of chemical solvents into the stairwell. Every step up the linoleum-covered stairs jarred my ribs. I kept my hand pressed flat against my side, a useless brace against internal damage. When I unlocked my front door and pushed it open, the silence hit me like a physical weight. It was a small, cramped space. The radiator in the corner clanked and hissed, fighting a losing battle against the draft leaking through the single-pane windows. Usually on a Thursday night, the air felt thick with dread. I would stand in the entryway, listening for the heavy, stumbling thud of Tom's boots on the stairs, waiting for the inevitable pounding on the door, the slurred demands for cash, the sudden explosive violence when I told him the register was empty. Tonight, there was nothing. Only the hum of the cheap refrigerator and the distant wail of a siren. I didn't turn on the overhead lights. I walked into the kitchen, the floorboards groaning under my weight, and poured a glass of tap water. My hands were still shaking. The tremor hadn't stopped since Kieran walked out of the shop. I leaned against the chipped Formica counter, staring at the dark street below, taking tiny, shallow sips of water. "Tell me his name, Nora. I'll end it." The memory of his voice didn't feel like a rescue. It felt like a trap springing shut. I was not a killer. I spent my days matching thread spools and smoothing out the wrinkles in other people's lives. I paid my taxes. I bought cheap coffee. I was ordinary to the point of being invisible. But with 3 words, I had pointed a loaded gun at a man's head and pulled the trigger. The guilt tasted metallic, settling heavy in the back of my throat. I hated Tom Miller. I hated the way he smelled of stale beer and cheap gin. I hated the coarse grit of his knuckles and the terrifying, empty glaze in his eyes when the switch flipped in his brain. But did I want him dead? Did I have the right to play God from the safety of a cutting table? I slept in my clothes that night, curled into a tight, miserable ball on top of my faded quilt. Every time the wind rattled the window pane, my eyes snapped open, my heart hammering against my bruised ribs, expecting to see Tom's silhouette in the doorway. Or worse, expecting to see Kieran Shaw coming to collect a debt I didn't know how to pay. Morning arrived dull and grey. The bruising on my collarbone had deepened to a sickening mottled black. I swallowed 3 ibuprofen on an empty stomach, wrapped the scarf around my neck, and went back to the shop. The day dragged by in a state of excruciating suspension. Every time the bell above the door jingled, my breath caught. But it was just Mr. Gable picking up his suit, then Mrs. Higgins dropping off a silk blouse, then a teenager needing dress pants hemmed for a homecoming dance. The mundane, ordinary rhythm of my life marched on completely indifferent to the execution I had authorized 12 hours prior. At 4 p.m., my cell phone buzzed against the wooden cutting table. It was a blocked number. I stared at the vibrating plastic rectangle. The sound was deafening in the quiet shop. My mouth went dry. I wiped my sweaty palms on my skirt, reached out and pressed accept. I didn't speak. I just brought the phone to my ear. "Hey." It was a woman's voice. Brash, tired chewing gum. It took my panicked brain 3 seconds to place it. Sarah, the bartender at the Rusty Anchor. Tom's preferred dive bar on the edge of the industrial district. "Sarah," I rasped. "Yeah, it's me. Sorry to bother you at work, Nora. You seen Tom?" The air in my lungs turned to ice. "No, why?" "He skipped his shift at the loading dock this morning. His foreman called the bar looking for him, thinking he was sleeping off a bender in a booth. But he wasn't here last night, which is weird because it was payday." She popped her gum, the sound crackling loudly through the speaker. "Figured he might be sleeping it off on your couch." "He's not here," I said. My voice sounded hollow, like it belonged to someone else. "We broke up, Sarah. He doesn't come around anymore." "Right. Well, if you see the asshole, tell him he left his jacket here on Tuesday. It's taking up space." "I will." The line went dead. I slowly lowered the phone. He missed payday. Tom Miller never ever missed payday. He needed the cash for the gin. If he wasn't at the dock, and he wasn't at the bar, I looked down at my hands. They were perfectly steady. The tremor was gone. The paralyzing, suffocating dread that had lived in my chest for 6 months had vanished, replaced by a cold, echoing vacuum. He was gone. Kieran Shaw had kept his word. 3 days passed. The world didn't end. The police didn't come knocking. Tom Miller simply ceased to exist, swallowed whole by the concrete and shadows of the city. By Tuesday afternoon, the sharp, stabbing agony in my ribs had downshifted to a dull, persistent throb. The heavy swelling had gone down, leaving behind a wide, ugly canvas of yellowish-green skin. I could breathe deeply without wincing as long as I didn't twist my torso too fast. The shop was quiet. I was finishing the repair on Kieran's jacket. The jagged tear near the armpit had been tricky. It wasn't just torn on a nail. The fabric had been violently yanked, stretching the warp and weft of the expensive wool. I spent 2 hours painstakingly weaving a tiny patch of identical charcoal thread over the breach, blending the edges until the scar was nearly invisible. I was pressing the final seam with the hot iron when the bell above the door gave its dull metallic clatter. I didn't need to look up. The air in the room shifted, growing instantly heavier. The faint, sharp scent of vetiver and rain cut through the smell of hot starch. I set the iron back on its cradle and turned off the steam. It's done. Kieran stood just inside the door. He was wearing a dark grey trench coat over a black turtleneck. His hands were shoved deep into his pockets. He didn't look like a man who had spent the weekend erasing a human life. He looked like a man who was annoyed by the traffic on 4th Avenue. He walked to the counter, his gait loose but painfully deliberate. A predator conserving energy. I pulled his jacket off the pressing board, slipped it onto a wooden hanger, and brought it to the front. I laid it flat on the glass counter between us. My eyes tracked the line of his jaw, the faint shadow of stubble, the absolute chilling calm in his pale eyes. "Good as new," I said. My voice was blessedly steady. Kieran looked down at the jacket. He ran a long, calloused index finger over the repaired seam. His touch was incredibly light, tracing the invisible stitches. "You do good work, Nora." "I try." He reached inside his trench coat and pulled out a thick, folded wad of bills. He tossed it onto the glass counter. It landed with a soft, heavy thud. It wasn't a few 20s. It was a stack of hundreds folded in half, held together by a silver money clip. There had to be $2,000 sitting there. I stared at the money. My stomach rolled violently. "The repair is $80. I said, my voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "It's just thread, Kieran. It's not worth that." "It's worth what I say it's worth." He didn't look at the money. He was looking at my neck. The scarf was gone. The shop was too hot, and the bruises on my throat had faded to a muddy brown that could in dim lighting be mistaken for a shadow. But in the harsh, fluorescent glare of the counter they were obvious. The remnants of a violent grip. "Take it back," I said, pushing the stack of bills toward him. The leather of his gloves brushed against my knuckles. I yanked my hand back as if I'd been burned. "I don't want it." "You have rent. You have a stack of past due notices sitting next to your sewing machine." His eyes flicked to the back room, catching the detail I thought I had hidden. "Take the money, Nora." "It's blood money!" I hissed the words, slipping out before my brain could stop them. The silence that followed was suffocating. I gripped the edge of the glass counter, my knuckles turning white, waiting for the explosion. Waiting for the cold, lethal anger I had seen in his eyes 3 nights ago. Instead, Kieran leaned forward, bracing both hands on the glass, crowding my space until I had to tilt my head back to look at him. His face was inches from mine. "Are you asking me a question?" He murmured, his voice a low, terrifying vibration. "No." I swallowed heavily. "I'm stating a fact." His eyes searched mine, dissecting the fear, the guilt, and the miserable, wretched relief that was warring inside me. He saw right through me. He knew I was sleeping better. He knew I wasn't looking over my shoulder anymore. Blood money pays the light bill just as well as clean money. Kieran said softly, "The city runs on it. Your ex ran on it. The only difference is I'm the one who decides who bleeds." He reached out his hand, moving so smoothly I couldn't flinch away in time. His fingers bypassed my jaw and settled warmly on the side of my neck, right over the fading thumbprints. His thumb brushed the hollow of my throat, feeling the rapid, frantic flutter of my pulse. "He won't ever touch you again." Kieran stated the words final absolute, an iron vault slamming shut. "He won't touch anyone. You made the right choice." "I didn't have a choice," I whispered, hating how wet my eyes suddenly felt. "You forced me. I gave you the option to save yourself. You took it. Don't play the martyr, Nora. It doesn't suit you." He dropped his hand from my neck, stepping back from the counter. The sudden loss of his body heat left me shivering. He picked up the jacket by the hanger, draped it over his forearm, and turned towards the door. "Keep the money," he said over his shoulder. "Buy something that isn't from a thrift store. You look too thin." "I'm not hungry," and I lied to his back. Kieran stopped with his hand on the brass doorknob. He looked back at me, his eyes narrowing slightly. Yes, you are. Lock the door. We're getting dinner. I should have said no. I should have told him to get the hell out of my shop, locked the deadbolt, and thrown the stack of hundreds into the alley. Instead, I stood in the middle of the shop, staring at the broad line of his shoulders, and realized I didn't want him to leave. The sheer pathetic loneliness of my life stretched out before me, a bleak hallway of empty nights, cold coffee, and the terrifying silence of an apartment where no one ever came looking for me. Kieran Shaw was a monster, but right now he was the only thing standing between me and the crushing weight of isolation. I reached up, turned off the fluorescent lights, and grabbed my coat. He didn't take me far. Just 3 blocks down to a quiet, dimly lit Italian place, tucked between a defunct hardware store and an empty lot. The sign outside was burned out, reading only Trattoria. When Kieran pushed the door open, the low hum of conversation immediately died down. The maitre d', a burly man with a broken nose, took one look at Kieran, swallowed hard, and gave a sharp nod. No menus were offered. No pleasantries exchanged. We were led to a deep, semi-circular mahogany booth in the very back, shadowed from the main dining room by a heavy velvet curtain. I slid into the booth, the leather creaking beneath me. The table was small. Too small. Our knees nearly brushed under the heavy white tablecloth. The air smelled of roasted garlic-rich red wine and melting wax from the single candle flickering in a glass orb between us. Kieran unbuttoned his coat and sat back watching me. He didn't look around the room to check the exits. He didn't scan the other patrons. He owned the room, and he knew it. "You're shaking again," he noted. I clasped my hands together in my lap, burying them in the folds of my coat. I'm not used to this. Eating, being seen with someone who makes an entire restaurant go quiet. I shot back, my defensive instincts kicking in. It was easier to be angry than to admit I was terrified. A waiter materialized out of the gloom, setting 2 heavy crystal glasses of water on the table, followed by a basket of warm, crusty bread wrapped in a white napkin. He didn't ask what we wanted. He just poured a generous measure of dark, inky red wine into a glass and set it in front of Kieran, then vanished as quickly as he appeared. Kieran picked up his glass, swirling the wine slowly. The candlelight caught the crimson liquid, casting blood-red reflections against the stark white tablecloth. They're quiet because they respect order. Kieran said, his tone conversational, as if we were discussing the weather. Chaos is bad for business. I keep the chaos out. By killing people. By removing variables. He corrected smoothly. He set the glass down and picked up a piece of bread, breaking it in half. The crust snapped loudly in the quiet booth. He set a piece on the small plate in front of me. Eat. I stared at the bread. My stomach was a tight-coiled knot. I hadn't eaten a full meal since Tom broke my ribs. The pain and the nausea had made food taste like sawdust. But the smell of the warm yeast was intoxicating. I don't understand you, I said, finally lifting my eyes to meet his. I hem your pants. I fix your linings. I am nothing to you, Kieran. Why are you doing this? Doing what? This. I gestured to the table, to the restaurant, to the thick stack of cash sitting in my coat pocket. Intervening? Sitting here? You're a boss. Don't you have people to shake down or docks to run? Kieran leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. The casual indifference melted away, leaving behind that dark, focused intensity that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I have a lot of people to run, Nora. I have an entire city trying to put a knife in my back and a police force looking for an excuse to kick down my door. My life is entirely transactional. People look at me and they see a bank vault or a stepping stone or a target. He reached across the table. I flinched, pulling back slightly, but his hand simply bypassed mine and picked up the small butter knife. He began to butter his piece of bread, his movements slow and precise. But you, he continued, not looking up. You just look at me and see a torn jacket. You don't ask me for favors. You don't try to leverage my name. You stand in that sweltering shop with broken ribs, terrified out of your mind, and you still try to tell me to mind my own business." He looked up, then the candle flame reflecting in the center of his pale irises. "I like things that are authentic, Nora. They are very, very rare in my world. And when I find something rare—" He trailed off, leaving the threat, the promise hanging in the air between us. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. The implication sank into my skin, heavy and permanent. He wasn't doing this out of pity. He wasn't a white knight. He was a collector, and he had just decided to put me on his shelf. "I'm not a pet, Kieran," I whispered, my voice trembling. "No," he agreed, picking up his wine glass again. "You're a survivor, which is why you're going to eat that bread, go home and pay your electric bill. And when I bring my suits in next week, you're going to hem them. We understand each other." I looked at the bread on my plate. Then I looked at the man across from me. He was a murderer. He was the reason a man I once loved or thought I loved was lying dead in a ditch or at the bottom of the bay. I should be screaming for the police. I should be running for the door. My hand moved, trembling slightly, and picked up the piece of bread. I took a bite. It was warm and rich, and it tasted like salvation. Kieran watched me chew, a faint, dark ghost of a smile pulling at the corner of his mouth. I had crossed a boundary line tonight, trading one monster for another. But as I swallowed the food, feeling the warmth spread through my hollow stomach, I realized the most terrifying truth of all: I didn't want to go back. November bled into December, bringing with it a bitter, biting cold that rattled the single-pane windows of my shop. My ribs stopped throbbing, fading from a sickly yellow to a pale, ordinary white. My reflection in the bathroom mirror returned to normal. The ghost of Tom Miller's fingerprints finally vanished from my throat, but the silence he left behind didn't feel like peace. It felt like a held breath. Kieran Shaw began coming into the shop twice a week. He never brought torn jackets anymore. He brought bolts of fabric. Heavy Italian wools, crisp Egyptian cottons, silks that pooled like liquid shadow over my cutting table. He ordered custom shirts, three-piece suits, overcoats that took me days of meticulous drafting to construct. He was buying my time. We both knew it. On a Tuesday afternoon, the sky outside was a bruised, heavy, grey, threatening snow. The shop was overheated, the radiators clanking in the corners. Kieran stood on the small wooden pedestal in front of the three-way mirror. He was down to his undershirt and trousers. I knelt at his feet, a mouth full of silver pins, adjusting the break of a charcoal trouser hem. "Too long," he murmured, looking down at the top of my head. "It's a half break," I said around the pins, my voice muffled. "It's standard. I don't like it catching on my shoes. Bring it up." I pulled the pins out smooth and fast, and folded the heavy wool up another quarter-inch, repinning it. My knuckles brushed against the leather of his Oxford shoes. The leather was immaculate, polished to a mirror shine. It was a stark contrast to the mud-caked work boots I used to listen for in the hallway. I swallowed hard, shoving the thought away. "Stand up straight," I instructed, rising to my feet. I picked up the yellow measuring tape from the counter. I needed his shoulder span and chest drop for the vest. Stepping up onto the pedestal with him put us eye to eye. The proximity was immediate, heavy, and entirely deliberate. "Arms up," I said softly. Kieran raised his arms parallel to the floor. I stepped into his space. The scent of him Vetiver clean soap and the faint, permanent undertone of gunpowder flooded my senses. I threw the yellow tape around his back, catching the metal tab as it swung around his left side. To measure a man's chest properly, you have to pull the tape snug right under the armpits, directly over the shoulder blades. You have to lean in. My forearms brushed his rib cage. I could feel the dense, coiled muscle through the thin white cotton of his undershirt. He was completely still, but his body felt like a loaded spring. 39. I noted my voice dropping a fraction as I read the number. I let my arms drop, but I didn't step back. The air on the pedestal felt too thick to breathe. Kieran didn't lower his arms immediately. He let them fall slowly, his hands coming to rest lightly on my hips. I froze. The tape measure dangled limply from my fingers. His touch wasn't tight. It wasn't possessive. It was simply a physical anchor, a heavy warmth pressing through the wool of my skirt. I looked up. His pale eyes were tracking the line of my throat, specifically the spot where the yellow-green bruises used to sit. "You're sleeping better," he observed. "How would you know? There are no dark circles under your eyes." His thumb brushed the fabric over my hip bone. "And you don't flinch when the bell rings." "I flinch when you walk in," I lied. The corner of his mouth twitched. It was the closest thing to a smile I had ever seen from him. "No, you don't. You tense up. There's a difference, Nora. Flinching is fear. Tensing is anticipation." He was right, and I hated it. I hated the treacherous thrill that spiked in my blood whenever his black car pulled up to the curb. I hated that I felt safer in the shadow of a mob boss than I ever did in the daylight. "I need your neck measurement," I whispered, desperate to break the tension. Kieran dropped his hands from my hips. He lifted his chin slightly, offering his throat. I wrapped the tape around his collar. My fingers grazed the warm skin of his neck. His pulse beat steadily, a slow, unhurried rhythm beneath my fingertips. He was looking at my mouth. I pulled the tape snug, perhaps a fraction too tight. He didn't blink. 15.5. I said, stepping back off the pedestal so fast I nearly tripped over the edge. I turned my back to him, grabbing my notepad and scribbling the numbers down with a shaking hand. "Are you afraid of me, Nora?" His voice came from right behind me. He had stepped off the pedestal. I didn't turn around. I stared at the graphite smudges on my notepad. "I'd be stupid not to be," I answered honestly. "That doesn't answer the question." "I know what you are, Kieran." I put the pencil down. The wood snapped softly against the glass counter. "I know how you fixed my problem. I know what happens to people who cross you. Yes, I am afraid of you." He stepped closer. His chest brushed my shoulder blade. "Look at me." I turned, trapped against the counter. His face was devoid of expression, but his eyes were a storm. "If you were afraid of me, you wouldn't have pulled that tape measure tight enough to choke me just now," he said, his voice dropping to a gravelly murmur. "You're not afraid of me. You're afraid of yourself. You're afraid that you like the quiet I bought you. You're afraid that you don't miss him." "I don't miss him." I fired back, the words tearing out of my throat, sharp and venomous. "I'm glad he's gone." The silence in the shop shattered. The truth hung in the air, ugly and raw. I had said it out loud. I was glad a man was dead. I had crossed a moral line and there was no walking back. Kieran reached out and grabbed the back of my neck. His grip was firm, anchoring me in place. He leaned down, his mouth hovering inches from mine. "Good," he breathed. "Now we can stop pretending." The bell above the door rattled violently, jarring me out of a deep focus. It was a Thursday morning, raining again, the city drowning under a freezing, sleet-filled downpour. I looked up from the sewing machine, half expecting to see Kieran's dark overcoat. Instead, two men walked in. They didn't belong in my shop. They wore cheap, off-the-rack suits that puckered at the seams. The taller one had a damp, beige trench coat and a face that looked like it had been carved from a block of tired clay. He flashed a badge, the gold shield catching the dreary light. Nora Vance. My stomach plummeted, a cold, leaden weight dropping straight into my boots. My mouth went completely dry. I stood up, resting my hand on the table to hide the sudden, violent tremor in my fingers. "Yes, Detective Wyatt. This is Officer Bennett." The taller man put his badge away and pulled a damp notepad from his coat pocket. He looked around the shop, his eyes lingering on the expensive bolts of silk in the corner, then settling back on me. "We're looking for Thomas Miller. We understand you two were involved." I dug my fingernails into my palms until the pain grounded me. "Breathe. We broke up," I said, my voice remarkably flat. "Months ago. I haven't seen him." Detective Wyatt flipped open his notepad. The pages were warped from the rain. That's not what his landlord says. Landlord says he moved out of his place in August, said he was crashing with his girl, and his foreman down at the docks said he used to come around here on payday. He used to... I agreed, holding the detective's gaze. Until I changed the locks on my apartment. He drank too much. I kicked him out. Did he have a habit of disappearing? Officer Bennett asked. He was younger, sharper, his eyes darting towards the back room. When he was on a bender, yes. He'd disappear for days. Then he'd show up needing cash. I was threading the needle of the truth, wrapping my lies in just enough reality to make them believable. Well, he missed his last 3 shifts. His sister called it in as a missing person. Wyatt clicked his pen, staring at me with a tired, calculating gaze. You sure he didn't come by here? Maybe last week, Tuesday night. The room tilted. Tuesday night. The night my ribs cracked. The night Kieran sat in that wooden chair and asked for a name. No. I lied smoothly, staring directly into the detective's eyes. I haven't seen him since September. Wyatt sighed, scratching the stubble on his chin. All right, if he shows up, or if he calls you, give us a ring. He pulled a crumpled business card from his pocket and set it on the glass counter. Guys like Miller, they usually turn up in a drunk tank or a ditch, but we gotta do the paperwork. I'll let you know, I said. I watched them walk out, the bell clattering behind them. I didn't move until their unmarked sedan pulled away from the curb and vanished into the sleet. Then my knees gave out. I slumped against the cutting table, sliding down the smooth wood until I hit the floor. I pulled my knees to my chest, wrapping my arms around my legs, shaking uncontrollably. I had just lied to the police in a homicide investigation. I was an accessory. I was bound to a Mafia boss by blood and a lie. You did well. I gasped, my head snapping up. Kieran stepped out from the heavy velvet curtain that separated the back storage room from the main shop. He had been there the whole time. He wore a black sweater, his gun holster clearly visible across his chest. He looked completely at ease, as if he hadn't just listened to the police ask about a man he buried. You were back there, I choked out, scrambling to my feet. If they had looked, they wouldn't have looked without a warrant, and if they did, they wouldn't have found me. Kieran walked over to the front door and flipped the deadbolt with a sharp click. He turned the open sign to closed. He walked back to me, his boots silent on the floorboards. He stopped in front of me, looking down at the crumpled business card on the counter. He picked it up, flicked his lighter, and set the edge of the card on fire. He dropped it into the metal trash can, watching the flames curl the cheap paper into black ash. You lied for me, he said. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of profound victory. I lied for myself. I argued, backing away until my hips hit the wall. If they arrest you, they look into me. They see the timeline. They see I pointed you at him. Stop lying to yourself, Nora. Kieran closed the distance between us, pinning me against the wall with his body. He braced his hands on the plaster on either side of my head. The smell of smoke and vetiver surrounded me. You didn't protect yourself just now. You protected me. You chose my side. There is no side, I whispered, desperately staring at his throat. I just want to be left alone. You don't want to be alone. You want to be safe. And you know exactly where the safety is. He reached down his fingers, catching my chin, forcing my face up. His pale eyes were dark with an intense, burning possessiveness. You're mine now. He stated, his voice a low, rough scrape. You stitched the suit, Nora. You're wearing it. He didn't wait for my answer. He brought his mouth down on mine. It wasn't a gentle kiss. It was a claim. It tasted like ash and black coffee and the cold metal of a gun barrel. It was brutal and entirely inevitable. My mind screamed at me to push him away, to hit him, to run. He was a monster, but my hands didn't push. They curled into the heavy wool of his sweater, gripping him tightly, pulling him closer. I opened my mouth for him, returning the violence with a desperate, crushing pressure. It was a kiss, built on a foundation of graves and lies, and it was the most intoxicating thing I had ever felt. I was drowning, and I was wrapping my arms around the anchor. Winter settled over the city like a suffocating blanket. The snow turned black on the streets within hours, matching the grim, relentless machinery of Kieran's world. He didn't try to hide what he did anymore. He would sit in the back of my shop, smoking cigarettes in the dark, taking phone calls that dictated the movement of drugs, weapons, and human lives. I would sit at the machine sewing silk linings, pretending not to hear the numbers, the threats, the cold calculations of a criminal empire. I had become his confessional and his sanctuary. It was 2 a.m. on a Friday. The shop was closed, the iron security gate pulled down over the windows. I was upstairs in my apartment trying to sleep when the heavy rhythmic pounding started on the front door. I bolted upright, my heart slamming against my ribs. For a fraction of a second, the old terror spiked Tom. Then reality crashed back in. Tom was gone. I grabbed my heavy robe, tied it tight, and walked to the door. I didn't ask who it was. I slid the chain off and turned the deadbolt. Kieran practically fell into the apartment. He was breathing heavy, short, ragged gasps. He didn't have his overcoat on. He was wearing a white button-down shirt, and the entire left side of it was soaked in a dark, slick crimson that looked black in the dim hallway light. "Lock it!" he gritted out, leaning heavily against the wall, leaving a bloody smear on the peeling wallpaper. I slammed the door, throwing the deadbolt and the chain, my hands slick with sudden sweat. "Kieran, oh my God! What happened?" "Disagreement!" he rasped, coughing. A thin line of blood trickled down his chin. "Down at the docks. Caught a piece of a knife. I need to call an ambulance." I spun toward the kitchen counter where my phone sat. "No." He pushed off the wall, grabbing my arm. His grip was weak, his fingers slipping, but the command in his voice was absolute. "No hospitals, no cops. You have a first aid kit. I have thread and rubbing alcohol, Kieran. I'm a tailor, not a doctor." "Skin is just fabric, Nora. Stitch it." He swayed, his knees buckling. I caught him, his dead weight driving us both toward the floor. I dragged him into the small bathroom, hauling him up to sit on the edge of the cold porcelain bathtub. The metallic smell of fresh blood was overpowering in the cramped space, mixing sickeningly with the sour smell of the dry cleaners venting below. I ripped the bloody shirt open. The buttons popped skittering across the linoleum tiles. The cut was jagged, running vertically down his left side, dangerously close to his ribs. It wasn't an artery, but it was deep. Fat and muscle tissue gaped open, welling with dark red blood every time he breathed. "Towels," I muttered, my voice shaking. "I need towels." I grabbed the only 2 clean towels I had and pressed them hard against the wound. Kieran hissed, his head dropping back against the tiled wall, his eyes squeezing shut. His chest heaved. "Press harder," he commanded through gritted teeth. I leaned my weight into it, my hands covered in his warmth. He was bleeding out in my bathtub. The man who had terrorized the city, the man who had bought my soul with a stack of hundreds and a dead body, was completely at my mercy. I looked at his face. The pale, lethal mob boss was gone, replaced by a sweating, pale man fighting to stay conscious. "I need to clean it," I said, my voice dropping into that flat, detached zone I used when fixing a ruined hem. "It's going to burn." I grabbed the bottle of rubbing alcohol from the cabinet. I pulled the soaked towels away and poured the liquid directly into the open gash. Kieran roared a guttural, animalistic sound of pure agony. His entire body bowed upward, his good hand blindly grabbing my hip, his fingers digging bruisingly into my flesh. "Hold still," I snapped, a sudden unfamiliar authority in my voice. "If you move, I can't close it." I grabbed a heavy curved upholstery needle from my sewing kit. I threaded it with thick black nylon thread. It wasn't sterile, it wasn't right, but it would hold the meat together until his private doctor could look at it. Bite down," I told him, shoving a rolled-up washcloth against his mouth. He took it between his teeth. His pale eyes locked onto mine, dilated and feral with pain. I pushed the heavy needle through his skin. He violently flinched, a low groan vibrating through the washcloth. I didn't stop. I pulled the thread tight, pulling the gaping edges of the wound together. "Breathe, Kieran," I murmured, my hands working quickly mechanically. "Just breathe." I stitched him up, just like I stitched the linings of his expensive suits. I worked the needle through muscle and fat, tying off the knots tight, sealing the violence inside him. My hands were stained dark red up to the wrists. By the time I cut the final thread, the bleeding had slowed to a slow ooze. I covered the ragged black stitches with heavy gauze and taped it down tightly. I sat back on the cold tile floor, resting my elbows on my knees, my breath coming in ragged pants. I stared at my bloody hands. Kieran spit the washcloth out. It hit the floor with a wet smack. He slumped forward, resting his forehead against my shoulder. He was shivering, the shock setting in. "You saved my life," he whispered against my neck. "You saved mine," I replied. The words tasted like copper and truth. I wrapped my arms around his broad, bloody shoulders, holding him steady in the harsh, fluorescent light of my cheap bathroom. We were broken, both of us. A tailor who hid her bruises and a killer who flaunted his. We had built a bridge out of a dead man's bones, and now neither of us could ever cross back. He tilted his head, pressing a bloody, exhausted kiss into the hollow of my throat, right where the old bruises used to be. "Mine," he murmured, closing his eyes. "Yours, I agreed to the quiet room, and as I held the devil in my arms, I realized I didn't want heaven anyway. If you enjoyed this deep dive into Mafia romance and psychological drama, don't forget to hit that like button to let us know. Share this video with your friends who love grounded, gritty storytelling, where the heroes are just as complicated as the villains. Subscribe to the channel and ring the bell so you never miss the next part of our dark romance series. Drop a comment below. What would you have done in Nora's shoes? Let's debate. Stay tuned, stay safe, and we'll see you in the next dark chapter.